The Ideological Hijacking of Science Funding by Robyn Blumner. From the March-April 2025 issue of Skeptical Inquirer. There is nothing more indicative of the morphing of good, progressive intentions into a hectoring, dictatorial regime of illiberalism and forced ideological conformity than the current DEI apparatus. While the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion all represent worthy aspirations, the way that related policies have often been deployed in practice looks more like Chinese re-education camps where no dissent is brooked. In many programs, diversity does not seem to mean welcoming people from vastly different backgrounds, views, or socioeconomic conditions. It means a laser focus on certain racial minorities, not Jews and Asians, and certain gender identities. Equity does not seem to mean equality of opportunity to ensure fairness regardless of race or gender. It means a regime of racial and gender representation that perfectly reflects population demographics, with any departure chalked up to racism or sexism. Inclusion does not apparently include white people and white men in particular, Jews, Asians, straight people, and the able. Often, it doesn't include these folks even if the people in these categories are in and of themselves poor and struggling. That kind of oppressive, identitarian DEI apparatus has insinuated itself into almost every category of institution, from the academy to the nonprofit world to corporate America. But where it is doing the most damage to people concerned about promoting and advancing science is in the arena of grant funding, where fealty to DEI has become a requirement for many science grants. Considerations of merit have been nudged aside in its service. An important piece on the issue appeared in July in the Chronicle of Higher Education by authors Robert George and Anna Krylov. Titled, "The Ruthless Politicization of Science Funding," the authors document just how extreme this orthodoxy has become and how much of science funding has been negatively impacted. They lay much of the blame on a federal mandate issued early on by then-President Joe Biden through executive orders, specifically EO 13,985 and EO 14,091. These executive orders essentially required scientists to demonstrate that their research and their teams advance DEI goals in ways that can take precedence over merit. I am writing this after the November 2024 election, but before the new administration has taken office. Undoubtedly, those executive orders will be withdrawn probably by the time you are reading this. But this wild seesawing between making DEI loyalty oaths and goals a supreme diktat and making the very idea of diversity verboten is not good for science. Science requires sober, long-term, predictable investments of time, money, and expertise. It should not be used as a political cudgel, no matter who is in charge. In this case, though, I blame the Democrats for acceding to left-wing identitarian demands to turn us all into two-dimensional representatives of our melanin, gametes, and pigeonholed identities. Frankly, it's patronizing, and in this case, it interferes with the pursuit of real science, which should be entirely merit-driven. As a quick aside, when I was a newspaper columnist in the late 1990s, the paper had us all take diversity training. We were all asked to identify our race, and I'll never forget this. A black employee in the physical plant department answered human. He said that he resented all this focus on race, even if well-meaning, and that we should all just be considered part of the human race. He knew better than any highly paid consultant I've ever met. In their Chronicle piece, George and Krylov described the current situation for scientists who hope to receive research funding from one of these federal agencies: the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The authors say that what was once an exercise in pure scientific merit has changed. Now, scientists must demonstrate how their proposed research will promote DEI goals. That means first confessing the sins of their own institutions or fields of study as being part of a systemic problem, whether that is true or not, and whether they believe it is true or not, then laying out a plan for remediation. George and Krylov point out if you are a scientist applying for funding from the National Science Foundation's Centers for Chemical Innovation grants, a 2-page diversity and inclusion plan is required. The funding agency wants to see diversity and inclusion in the research team at all levels and in leadership and advisory groups. In other words, building a team is an exercise in racial and gender bean counting. They cite a blatant example of this at the National Institutes of Health, where in 2021, scientists were told that if they identified as Black or from another underrepresented group, their applications would be given additional consideration even if the quality score that peer review panels award the proposals falls outside the cutoff for most grants. That effort was retracted, but there is still clear diversity speak messaging that the race of who is on the team counts for funding purposes. This is despite federal civil rights law that prohibits taking race into account as a condition of funding. Just how far all this has gone was driven home by a startling report by Senator Ted Cruz. When the report was released in October, Cruz was the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. His not subtle press release declared, "New Cruz investigation reveals how Biden-Harris diverted billions from scientific research to DEI activists," and it included the accompanying table of funding over the past 4 years for the National Science Foundation, one of the federal government's main science grant-making institutions. And before you dismiss the report as purely right-wing propaganda, my question is, why are we giving people such as Cruz this kind of ammunition? Even if the report is full of cherry-picking and exaggerations, which it undoubtedly is, some of those cherries are really bad. And it is just those kinds of examples that put science and science funding on the defensive. Jerry Coyne, emeritus professor of evolutionary biology from the University of Chicago, reviewed the report on his highly recommended website, Why Evolution is True, and reported that active researchers and scientists tell him that the entire system of grant-making has changed in the past decade exactly in the way the Cruz report describes, basically altering the grant-making process from one of pure scientific merit to an exercise in so-called social justice. The Cruz report identifies a Biden administration-created task force on scientific integrity that was charged with reviewing the impact on scientific integrity of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at all science agencies. The task force determined that federal science agencies should incorporate DEIA considerations into all aspects of science planning, execution, and communication. The A stands for accessibility. What does that look like? The Cruz report provides some examples. In 2022, NSF gave Columbia University $4.4 million for its Implementing Novel Solutions for Promoting Cultural Change in Geoscience Research and Education program to decolonize geoscience. In 2023, Shirin Vasawi of Northwestern University was co-principal investigator for an NSF grant of over $1 million for a project titled Reimagining Educator Learning Pathways through Story Work for Racial Equity in STEM. The Cruz report points out that she had co-authored an op-ed in 2020 claiming the ideology of white supremacy permeates all of the nation's institutions, including our existing system of STEM education, whether or not they claim to embrace diversity. In 2023, NSF awarded nearly $5 million to 3 university researchers for the ongoing project Black Girls as Creators, an intersectional learning ecosystem toward gendered racial equity in artificial intelligence education. Taryn Kruma, who obtained nearly $3 million of that grant, is an assistant professor at ASU's School of Social Transformation and Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. She and her co-author wrote in a 2021 article, cited by the Cruz report, that intersectionality, critical race feminism, culturally relevant pedagogy, and the concept of resistance should be applied to STEM education. They said STEM was strangled by a paradigm of whiteness. And it's not just that science research dollars are being used to support an ideological agenda that condemns white biologists, chemists, physicists, geologists, engineers, and computer scientists for their race. It's that this makes science a subjective and politicized endeavor rather than what it should be, a highly competitive, rigorous, evidence-based enterprise with measurable standards and outcomes that advance America's scientific and technological prowess without regard for who is doing it. Trust in science has sharply declined since the COVID-19 pandemic and has done so most starkly along partisan lines. Surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center show that among Republicans, confidence in scientists went from 85% in April 2020 to 66% in October 2024. Whereas 88% of Democrats expressed confidence in scientists in the latest survey. Science and scientists have lost their perceived political neutrality, and that is not a good outcome for any of us. I anticipate many challenges ahead for science as a result of who the Trump administration intends to put into key posts. The announced nominees for various public health and science posts are a gallery of anti-vaxxers, pseudoscience boosters, conspiracy theorists, and unqualified hacks. It's wholly disheartening. But if there is any tiny sliver of good to come out of it, maybe, just maybe, there will be a reboot of science research funding and a return to a process in which recommendations come out of quality peer review by people with relevant scientific expertise, a reboot free of considerations of the researcher's race or gender or whether their research advances DEI goals. I believe our future as a prosperous country depends on letting scientists do science and science alone. Thank you for listening to Skeptical Inquirer Audio Edition. This podcast is produced by the Center for Inquiry at our headquarters in Amherst, New York. If you would like to support our work, please consider subscribing to Skeptical Inquirer magazine at skepticalinquirer.org. It is listeners like you that make our work possible. With your support, we can continue to promote science, reason, and secular values throughout the world. Thank you.